Today, we're going to approach anxiety and depression from an angle that, at least in conventional medicine, is almost never taken, and that's the angle of immune depletion, or the involvement of the immune system in anxiety and depression. Does it play a role? What role does it play? And as you can see from the title of the presentation, it obviously plays a role, and actually plays a causal role, as new research has shown. And so if immune depletion is behind your anxiety and or depression, then an anti-anxiety or antidepressant medication is not going to help you. Or if it helps you, it's at least not going to address the cause. So if you have anxiety and or depression, and you have not received the benefits you'd hope to from medication, or from talk therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy, or whatever strategies you're using, perhaps it's not because those therapies aren't useful, but because those therapies are being applied to a puzzle for which they are not the solution. So if yours is immune depletion, then we have to see that and address that. So that's what today's presentation is about. And I think this is really exciting because, if you've been around me long enough, I'm really into the immune system, and the immune system is involved in everything we do, whether good or bad, positively or negatively. And so I think this will be enlightening for you. And this is driven by this paper that was just recently published. And the title is "Transient Anxiety and Depression-like Behaviors Are Linked to the Depletion of FOXP3 Expressing Cells via Inflammasome in the Brain." It's a big nerdy mouthful, but essentially we're going to dissect this so you understand that this paper is showing that anxiety and depression are caused, or one causal pathway for anxiety and depression is depletion of FOXP3 cells in the immune system. And it says transient in the title, but it can also be chronic or long-term and irreversible if it goes long enough, which we'll address later in the presentation. And so, you'll see a bunch of jargon here, like forkhead BOXP3, which stands for FOXP3, which is a transcription factor that influences immune cells to become T regulatory cells. And it's the depletion of T regulatory cells that causes the anxiety or depression. But I'm going to show you it in a less nerdy way, or at least a more visual way, and then we'll circle back to this research. But know also that the research showed that depletion of these cells also contribute to Alzheimer's disease. So if you're not interested in anxiety or depression, but you are in Alzheimer's or dementia in general, then this also is relevant for you. So we'll circle back to this paper in a little bit, but first I'll show you my book here that you can find on Amazon. It was an Amazon bestseller. It's called The Autoimmune Answer, and in it I dissect more of this immune stuff in the context of autoimmunity, and there's lots of nuggets in there. So check that out if you like. You can download the audio version for free at functionalmedicinecharlotte.com/free. But in it is this image to the right here with all the THs on it. This image is in the introduction of the book, where I'm explaining how the immune system can go awry and in how many different ways to influence autoimmunity, but also it's applicable to cancer and neurodegeneration and all kinds of other things. But pertinent to our conversation today is one of these pathways, specifically the T regulatory cell pathway. As we saw a moment ago, that the research paper that we're going to be looking at said FOXP3 T regulatory cells, when they're depleted, that's a causal mechanism for anxiety and depression and promotional of Alzheimer's. And so how do we get T regulatory cells to begin with? If they're depleted and driving our anxiety and depression, it'd be useful to know how we can promote production of more Treg cells, right? From a physiology standpoint, and from a new, lifestyle standpoint. So the kind of immune 101 story is in this picture, where we've got two sides to the immune system, You see the little cloud-shaped thing, that's a dendritic cell over there. That's the innate side of the immune system. We have two sides, the innate side and the adaptive side. The innate side is the dendritic cell. Those are the first responders. Those are the immune cells that come into first contact with foreign things, whether that's an infection or pollen or a food or a toxin of some kind. They're going to, and that foreign thing is represented by the dark black circle there. And so when they first contact it, they'll grab it, and then they go to a lymph node and they present it to a naive T cell, which is represented by the Th0 cell there. And that's the baby cell of the adaptive immune system. So think of it as a chubby baby with wrist lines and ankle lines, right? It's cute, but pretty useless. It has to mature into an adult to be useful. So that Th0 cell could become one of any 7 of these careers, so to speak, okay? And what determines which career it grows up and matures into is what's on these different arrows here. And that's outside the context of today's video, but we've covered it in other videos. I covered it in my book. But for today, we want it to mature into the T regulatory cell. And so the way that we get the naive T cell to mature into the T regulatory cells, we need more TGF beta in the environment, or transforming growth factor beta. And what is that? That is an immune messenger that influences the babies to grow up to be Tregs. And so we can promote TGF beta function with different nutritional strategies and nutrients, which we'll talk about later. But the reason that's important is because TGF beta in the right context at the right level will cause T regulatory cell differentiation, and then the Treg cells are the regulators of our immune system. So I like to say they are the Warren G cells of your immune system. If you are familiar with hip hop, and I guess it'd be like 90s rap, Warren G was one of the early rappers. Here's a current, I guess a relatively current picture of him on top, but this is him in his video from, late 90s, early 2000s, the song The Regulators, right? Regulate. And so in the song, they yell, regulators. And so when I saw this paper about Tregs, I said, those are the Warren G cells of our immune system. They regulate the immune system. They promote balance. Okay, so say you have an infection, it's appropriate to mount an inflammatory response against that infection and to kill it. But once that infection is killed, you don't want to stay inflamed. So that's where the regulators come. The Warren Gs, or the T regulatory cells, they come in and they promote an anti-inflammatory environment. They put the fire out. They tell the pro-inflammatory cells to calm down and go away. And they resolve that inflammation and bring you back to balance. Okay, so we need the T regulatory cells because they are the regulators. Without them, we stay inflamed. And staying inflamed promotes, in the context of today's video, it promotes many things, but in the context of today's video, it promotes and causes the anxiety, the depression, the promotion of Alzheimer's. So we obviously don't want that if we want to have a healthy mental state and quality of life. So let's see what the paper says. Let's dive in a little bit. So back to our paper, and if we start in the top, it says, this study investigated the causal role of FOXP3 expressing cells in the promotion of neurobehavioral responses associated with neuroimmune crosstalk between peripheral and central immune systems. Basically, it's saying, okay, how do T regulatory cells influence anxiety and or depression or neurobehavioral responses, especially because T regulatory cells are in the peripheral immune system. So they're outside the brain, they're elsewhere in the body, and the brain is supposed to be what's called immune privileged. So, certain immune cells and foreign bodies are not supposed to be able to get through the blood-brain barrier and into the brain. But here they say, we found that transient depletion of FOXP3 cells causally promoted transient anxiety and depression-like behaviors, possibly through mechanisms involving transient activation of inflammasomes, MMP9 expression in the brains, and dysregulation of circulating innate immune cells. We also found that depletion of FOXP3 or Treg cells in a mouse model of Alzheimer's is causally associated with Alzheimer's type cognitive impairments and neuropathology. This study suggests a causative role of Treg depletion in the proliferation of peripheral immune cells that contribute to transient activation of innate immunity in the brain, cause anxiety, depression, or impaired cognitive function. I know, sorry, it looks like a lot, but it's worth it. So if we look at the first blue line on the left side, if we look at the red on top, so you'd say, well, how could immune cells that are outside the brain impact inside the brain? Well, essentially, a depletion of the Treg cells drives systemic inflammation in the body. And if you have too much inflammation in the body for too long, ultimately that's going to spill over into the brain and drive neuroinflammation. And the way that it does that is one way is stated in the red at the top. It says multiple pathways involving the transport of cytokines or chemokines, which are immune messengers, across the blood-brain barrier to gain entry into the brain when the blood-brain barrier is compromised or absent. The binding of these cytokines or chemokines to specific receptors on the immune cells of the brain triggers activation of inflammasomes in the brain. And this, they reference one paper that shows that it happens in major depression patients. Intervention promoting Treg cells in the periphery may causally attenuate acute forms of anxiety and depression, coincidentally with restoration of potentially innate immune cascades in the brain. So basically, that there says if we can optimize the Tregs in the periphery, out in the body, and quiet the inflammation in the body, that can attenuate the anxiety and depression in the brain, because decreasing the inflammatory cascade out in the body that led to the brain inflammation could help put the brain fire out and reduce the symptoms that it caused. Now in the purple, they say, we hypothesize that chronic inflammatory responses mediated by the depletion of the Treg cells eventually cause irreversible neurological damages, including blood-brain barrier disruption and a permissive pro-inflammatory state, leading to chronic inflammation in the brain, explaining certain forms of untreatable anxiety and depression conditions. Okay, so I said earlier, this paper, even in the title, is talking about depletion of Tregs that causes transient anxiety and depression. Well, here they say, okay, here's the pathway on how that happens, and they hypothesize that if this pathway stays chronic, it could become irreversible and lead to chronic inflammation and untreatable anxiety, depression, and maybe Alzheimer's. So basically, if you tip that inflammation domino over and let those dominoes continue to fall without taking action to address, with the goal of restoring Treg cells and the regulators, then things may go downhill quick. And then if you jump over to the right-hand side in the red, moreover, our findings suggest that modulating the central immune responses mediated by Treg cells in the peripheral system could be a potential therapeutic strategy in Alzheimer's disease. In other words, if we can optimize Treg function, perhaps that will be therapeutic not only for anxiety and depression, but even Alzheimer's. And I'm biased towards natural strategies, but I think so too. And I've had a lot of positive outcomes with neurodegenerative patients where medicine said we can't help you, where we said, well, let's address, global physiology and inflammatory triggers all over the place and see how you do. And many times people improve where they weren't on medications with the best conventional care. So I think that their hypothesis is correct, and I'm excited for future research to show that. So lastly, collectively, our study supports that Treg cells may causally influence peripheral immune response that induces transient pro-inflammatory cascade in the brain, leading to anxiety and depression-like behaviors or cognitive decline. So we want to increase the Treg cells. We want to increase the regulators. How do we do that? Well, there's multiple ways to do that naturally. There's multiple things in our tool belt that promote Treg function and promote Treg differentiation, so more Tregs. Those things include, this is not an exhaustive list, it's a short list, but one that is a great start: vitamin D, vitamin A, glutathione, fish oil, butyrate, which is a short chain fatty acid produced by probiotic fermentation of fibers and things in your diet. And then probiotics themselves through other pathways can also promote Treg function. So you can see that there's lots of nutrients that are very useful in promoting Treg function, which promotes a balanced, healthy immune system, one that can respond with inflammation when necessary, say against an infection, but one that also resolves the inflammation once the antiviral response has been successful. And when you resolve it appropriately, then you're not driving yourself towards autoimmunity, okay? Because killing the virus and then staying inflamed when there's no more virus to hit, now there's only you that the immune system can hit, and that self-damage can become autoimmunity if it goes on for too long. So we want regulators, we want Warren G's all around us promoting healthy immune response. And so you'll notice that all of these things are components of a healthy diet. And so here's a paper that, if you said, well, what else can I do? This paper entitled, "Your Regulatory T Cells Are What You Eat: How Diet and Gut Microbiota Affect Regulatory T Cell Development." And so this paper deep dives into, here's certain nutrients, here's certain probiotics, here's how the different macros like protein and carbs and fats influence your regulatory T cells. So this helps you, you could theoretically create a Treg diet out of this, to go along with all the other millions of diets there are for specific things out there. So if you want further reading, that's available. That's a free paper online. You could just Google that title and you will get the information. So again, if you are wrapping it up, if you are someone with anxiety and depression that has not been responsive to traditional treatments, this pathway is one worth looking at. And so where you would look is, you want to look for chronic inflammation in the system. And so if you've got anxiety and depression and you went to your doctor, say, and your inflammatory markers are elevated, such as neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio, ESR, high sensitivity C-reactive protein, uric acid, these things could be an indication of unresolved chronic inflammation, and that may be due to lower Treg cells. And so taking action to replete those may take care of your anxiety and depression.